In times of stress, all of these banks are having to make payments to their correspondents, okay, or abroad or something. They all need to make payments in gold. They all would like to withdraw their account at the clearinghouse. They're all under stress. They may transfer these clearinghouse certificates to their members, but then they could run out of clearinghouse certificates and they still can't make payments. So this is a problem, even for the biggest banks in times of financial stress. Because remember those numbers we saw. All of these banks in the hinterlands are holding their reserves in the New York City banks. And the New York City banks do not have enough gold to cover this. Okay? So in times of stress, they're in trouble. The clearinghouse, in times of stress, creates money. And it creates money by not this bilateral borrowing from members, okay, but by joint borrowing and lending in this way. Okay, so in a real crisis, so here's or borrow from the central clearinghouse. Borrow from the clearinghouse itself. And how would that work? Loan to A, and I'm going to put 6% interest there. And what does the clearinghouse do? How does it make this loan? It makes this loan by printing up another little piece of paper, okay, which is a clearinghouse loan certificate bearing interest of 6%, okay, which is guaranteed by the clearinghouse, not by A. So this is a liability of the clearinghouse. The clearinghouse will try to get all kinds of collateral from A to make sure that they repay. They're going to say, well, I know you don't have any gold, but surely you have a firstborn child, you know, or something else that you can pledge here that you really are going to want to repay this loan because otherwise I get to keep this. So they might have some securities of some kind, government securities, something like that. So there'll be some security behind this loan to A. Look at what's happening here. We've created money. Okay, we've expanded the balance sheet on both sides. At the very center of the system, the very top of the system, not center of the system, the very hierarchical apex of the system, we've created more of the best money in the system. Okay, a debt on the New York City clearinghouse. Okay, which you can transfer to other banks that are looking to be paid. And these clearinghouse loan certificates begin to circulate among banks as if they were gold, right? The clearinghouse certificates are gold, you know, or they represent gold. Right? There's gold in the clearinghouse for each one of these. There is not gold in the clearinghouse for each one of these. These are clearinghouse loan certificates. And it will say on them, clearinghouse loan certificate, okay? But it looks an awful lot like this, okay? And it is treated exactly the same. It's treated by the banks as if because it's really both of these are liabilities of the central bank, here I'm already slipping, of the clearinghouse. There is no central bank, the clearinghouse. So this is, during times of crisis, this is an expansion of the money supply. This is a kind of lender of last resort operation that's going on here that is managed by this clearinghouse. This is what we had in the United States before we had central banking. And we still have it. The New York City Clearinghouse still exists. It still does separate clearing with its members, okay? The members, and a lot of the clearing of the Eurodollar market abroad, okay, happens in this setting. It still exists, this clearinghouse. But we also have a central bank. There was a hand up there.
Yeah, I was curious how they decided the rate and the acceptable amount of collateral.
Well, this is a mutual thing. So it is agreed. There's a committee that will be meeting to make this decision. Okay, and 6% at 1907 is a very high number. So this is like the Bagehot rule: lend freely at a high rate against good security. Okay, so this is meant to be a rate that is pretty high, so that a bank that's borrowing at that rate has an incentive to pay that back. They don't really want to. They actually had problems. Now that you mention this, there were problems because it was such a high rate. People who got clearinghouse loan certificates kind of liked to hold on to them often. You know, it was like a nice yielding asset. You know, it's the safest asset in the system. It's a liability of the clearinghouse, and it pays 6%. What could be wrong with that? And so sometimes when the crisis was over, they had a hard time getting these things back. They didn't want to be repaid, okay? And even though A repaid, it was hard for the clearinghouse to get this back. They managed, you know, they're powerful, so they managed to do this. But it's meant to be a high rate, okay? And it's meant to be good collateral, good security. That bankers all know. The bankers know each other. They know what they would view as good collateral themselves, and they're not going to take garbage. They're not going to take garbage. In that sense, it's not the same as as the Fed, okay, which can decide, you know, you don't have anything better than that? All right, you know, I'll let it pass, okay? Typically, if you didn't have acceptable collateral for the clearinghouse, what you had to do was find somebody who would lend you some acceptable collateral, and then you would borrow from the clearinghouse. So there's a bilateral feature to it, and then there's a mutual feature to it. This is all sort of arcane, okay? But you can see how you can start to build in your mind a picture of the network character of this, the hierarchical character of the network, the credit character of what's going on here, the discipline character, the ability of the people at the top to make decisions just because we know each other and trust each other that have large consequences for the system as a whole, positive or negative. Young mentions in his beautiful chapters that in times of crisis, they would refuse to pay. These New York banks would actually refuse to pay deposits of banks in the hinterland. They wouldn't send them reserves. Or they would send them, offer a clearinghouse loan certificate, just say, take it or leave it. You know, we're not going to pay you gold at all, okay? We just refuse. We just refuse. And they're able to do that. They save their gold for paying, paying, you know, abroad. You know, they're the Bank of England or somebody who you can't just say, take one of these. The Bank of England will say, no, we're not a member of your clearinghouse. No way. We're not going to take one of these. We're the Bank of England. So they'll demand payment in proper international money. It was never clear that this was legal, because this is money, right? And there are laws about money that remember I mentioned before about the national banking system that there were these special class of government bonds, that 2% bonds that you could issue currency against, okay? That's not what's going on here. That's not what's going on here. They're issuing these things against loans from their members, okay? And it's being used as if it were money. So there was always a kind of quasi, you know, the bankers did this behind closed doors, and as long as they did it with each other, and these certificates never sort of showed up in circulation, you wouldn't they got away with it. Okay, but sometimes they would show up in circulation, okay? And so there was an issue about this. Are they breaking the law? But it seems like, and they're doing this for their members, not for the general public. It seems like they're playing favorites, okay? So there was a big issue. One consequence of the crisis of 1907, okay, was they passed a law to say it's legal to do this. It's legal to do this. This is okay. And there was actually some specific characterization in that law of what kind of collateral is acceptable and so forth. I don't remember offhand exactly what it was, but there was an act passed. Some people say, still to this day, okay, that's all that should have been done. We never should have had a central bank. All we needed to do was bless this and call it a day, and we don't need central banks, okay? There are definitely people who believe that and write books about that. And there's a certain truth to that, okay? You know, once you understand what they're doing, you could say, well, what they were doing is lender of last resort, sort of, in a decentralized kind of way, and it worked, so let's legalize it. And then when the crisis is over, you just pay these all back and you shrink back and you have a discipline system again. So you have a discipline system in the good times, and then in crisis you. So it did work. Ultimately, the pressure to get a central bank came from the fact that the New York bankers were playing favorites, okay, with each other. And it seemed like this should be put under some democratic control. The banks in the hinterlands who were being not paid during this time when everybody needed to be paid, okay, and maybe they defaulted and maybe they went bankrupt and all of this, because of that, to save the New York banks, they put pressure to change the system. And that's how we got the Fed. And the Fed, one way to understand the Fed is that it is basically a clearinghouse.